Welcome to Hexapodcast, brief discussions about insects and entomologists with your hosts, John Steyerman and Lee Dyer.
Hey Steyerman, I'm going to start us out here. So this is a short story. It's a short origin story, the origin of a project that I had with this fire ecologist, Joe O'Brien, an old friend of mine, where we were studying how fires maintained plant and insect diversity at Eglin Air Force Base. There are a lot of fires there. Some of the fires are from military activity, but most of the fires are because this is longleaf pine where there's a 3-year fire return interval for various reasons, and everything's fire adapted there. So fire's a good thing. And we had to go out to DC to get this project approved, and it was this thing where we had to sit in front of this panel that would grill people about the research that they wanted to get funded. And we sat and watched several other projects go down in flames where they were asking them all kinds of very difficult questions and being pretty mean to them. And I wasn't really prepared for that. So when we got up there, I thought they were going to just grill me and tell me I didn't know anything about insects. I wasn't really an entomologist, and there's no way they were going to give us any money. But instead, one of the military guys looked at Joe and was like, "Man, how did you become a fire ecologist? That's super cool." And that's all they talked about. Nobody wanted to know how I became an entomologist. And I'm actually not really an entomologist, I don't know. But that origin story was not discussed. And I thought I'd start with you, John Steyerman, telling us how you became an entomologist, because I kind of vaguely remember some stories you've told me, but
there's like a long version of that story, and there's
let's hear the
probably
long version.
I think there's multiple things, Okay, so one thing is that when I was a kid, I loved dinosaurs, right? And I also love monsters. Like, I like to watch all the monster movies.
Since the very first bedtime, all around the world, children have known that once their mothers and fathers tucked them in and shut off the light, that there are monsters hiding in their closets, waiting to emerge.
Science fiction and aliens and all these things, and insects appeal to me because they're so foreign to us, right? They're not like a dog or a cat, like that we can kind of relate to. They're wildly different. They're completely different kinds of organisms, and they're kind of alien in their own way. And so I think that I like the strangeness and the weirdness and the differentness of insects. All kids are kind of entomologists, right? Like, they all kind of start, everybody likes bugs and worms and things like that, right? And then most people, maybe due to cultural things, they kind of grow out of it, and insects are bad. And I mean, I think I maintained an interest in insects partly because my father was like, he knew a lot of stuff about, we'd go out on hikes and he knew all the plants. He could tell me what all the flowers, but he knew insects as well. And he had a net, and we would sort of collect stuff, and we wouldn't do anything with it. We just like look at it. He had a microscope, and we, go home and we'd look at the critters. And
this was in Utah, in the mountains of Utah around Salt Lake.
So I think that was part of it, but I wasn't like one of these kids. There are a lot of entomologists that, knew they wanted to be an entomologist from when they were 5 years old or 6 years old, and they're out collecting.
I agree. That's pretty common for like the hardcore entomologists, especially the taxonomists, stematists. They always wanted to do that, and they had a collection when they were a kid.
Yeah, but I don't think I was really that way so much. I mean, I think I had an interest in science, and then getting older, I like to be outdoors. I like to hike and backpack and also, again, I was often with my father, who knew stuff. Right, he'd be like, "Oh, that's not just a tree. That's this kind of tree. That's not just some little flower." And so it was more than just like hiking for the vistas. It was like, "Hey, look at that thing." So I think that was part of it too. That I liked being outside, and at some point, you're outside, you're looking at stuff, and you're like, "Well, what is that?" And I've seen that thing before, and then I think there's a kind of a natural maturation where you're like, "Well, I want to know more about that," or why is that growing there and not there? Why is this bug around this season and not later in the season? Things like that.
So you're pretty primed by the time you went to the university, but was it actually an entomology course in the university that was a tipping point?
As an undergraduate, I started working in a lab. and I started initially just volunteering. Yeah, it was Don Feener's lab in Utah, and he's working on ants and their interactions with these forward parasitoids. And there was a graduate seminar reading through Godfrey's parasitoid book, chapter by chapter, and talking about it. And I got to sort of sit in on that. And when I first learned about parasitoids, yeah, that really appealed to that whole monster thing, right? Like,
that's not a wasp that came across a dead cockroach and said, come on, I'll climb inside, you take a picture. It'll be hilarious. No, that's a wasp that just finished eating its way out of the cockroach's body. So if it seems like Nancy is overreacting a bit, she's not, because that wasp wants to lay an egg in her body.
Reading through that parasitoid book, that got me pretty jazzed. And he worked with these fly parasitoids, and basically nothing was known about the fly parasitoids. So I got really interested in them. I think that's working in his lab is when I really thought like, wow, this is really cool. I want to learn more about this. And I never really had a plan to become an entomologist, but I was just really interested in it and did whatever I could do to learn more and be more involved.
So that kind of brings us to this part of this conversation, and that is the career pathways, because not many entomologists, they just get an undergraduate degree in entomology and from like an entomology department, or they just have one class in entomology and they do really well and they're able to get a job that's related to that. But a lot of professional entomologists go on to graduate school, and that was sort of our pathway. But was that let's talk about that pathways first, your pathway, and then other ways that people get to become entomologists.
But I just want to say one thing, like,
Yeah.
I didn't set out to become an entomologist, right? I was
Right.
interested in all kinds of organisms and ecology and evolution. But, insects did grab my interest, and I kind of became an entomologist by learning more and more about insects until I knew enough about insects that people started referring to me as an entomologist, right?
Yeah.
Other people called me an entomologist long before I called myself an entomologist.
So I'm not saying that you actually set out to do that, but I think you were from undergrad, you took this pathway that a lot of entomologists do, where you went to graduate school.
Right.
And that was more evolutionary biology, right? But the model system were insects.
Yeah, ecology and evolutionary biology, kind of both. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it wasn't this like, oh, here's a model system. Is that I guess I did really get interested in this group of, tachinid flies, these parasitoid flies, and then I wanted to know everything about them, especially because like we don't know much about them, and so it was like this kind of open territory, and they were super diverse. There was, it seemed like the possibilities were endless.
Yeah. So that's yeah. My own pathway to entomology is very simple to describe, because I had no interest in insects ever my entire youth and growing up, and I loved the outdoors, but I liked to hike and climb and play sports and do everything outside. Dean Bowers, who became my advisor, she's an entomologist. She's a real entomologist, but she's also a chemical ecologist. She saw that I had a degree. One of my degrees was in biochemistry, and that I was an English major. I could write. And she said, "Hey, caterpillars are way better herbivores than cows. It's like, you should come work with me." And I was like, I don't really want to study caterpillars, but I want to live in Boulder. So I said yes. And then when I went to took an OTS course in Costa Rica, my first year as a graduate student, and started collecting caterpillars and watching ants. And that was it. I was hooked. I could have been any other kind of insect, but the caterpillars really grabbed my attention. And so that's this one pathway. So both of us went to graduate school, not necessarily to study just insects, but to study ecology, evolution, maybe a little bit of conservation biology. But there are a lot of different types of entomologists, like the military has entomologists because
Right.
we have conflicts in all these tropical countries where there's insect vector diseases. There's chemical companies figuring out how to kill insects. And what else is there?
A lot of the money and initiatives behind entomology for a lot of the history of entomology have been studying pest species, right? Studying herbivores, herbivorous insects that are pests in our crops and ways to control them or manage them. So the USDA has a long history of employing entomologists, for example, but also companies that are chemical companies, wherever they're, or other maybe also some just general ag companies um, that are assessing the efficacy of their transgenic crops, in terms of resistance to insects, employ
What about
entomologists.
conservation organizations? Now there's this big interest in like pollinators and native pollinators and their importance and how we should be focusing on conservation of those. I think that's not an easy job to get, and typically they're looking for PhD scientists, but not always.
Well, actually, I just got contacted by a guy from the Kentucky sort of nature preserves. He just got hired as some biologist for the Kentucky nature preserves, who's an entomologist, and he reached out to me to talk to me about they've been like sampling insects in the nature reserves, and he says they're getting lots of these tachinid flies, and he wanted to like chat with me about ways that we could collaborate. So certainly there are people, entomologists, that have gone into more conservation management related fields. That's true.
And then the big one that is sort of an elephant in the room here that since insects are vectors of so many terrible diseases, including one of the worst global diseases, malaria, is mosquito vectored. There are a lot of epidemiologists or people working in the health sciences who are trying to figure out how to combat insect vector diseases that don't necessarily go the academic route. So I have a PhD student right now from Uganda who had been working for 15 years studying malaria and trying to figure out how to control mosquitoes and not control mosquitoes, but how to prevent them from vectoring malaria. And then she decided to get a PhD, but she was doing that work without a PhD. The other thing, oh, go ahead.
Real quick, like I think medical entomology is a fairly big field. I don't know where all those people are employed, whether they're employed publicly or through sort of medical private businesses, but there's a lot of emphasis and interest in medical entomology.
Yep.
So it's like, mosquitoes, fleas, lice, bed bugs.
And forensic entomology is another one that's not that common, but I'm starting to meet more and more students who say, I would like to be a forensic entomologist. And so they do. The only forensic entomologist I've ever known is this guy, Boris Kondratiev at CSU in Fort Collins. And he's got crazy stories of crimes that he's solved, some of them involving flies, which I know you like. And those stories are for a future episode of this. I don't even know what we're called yet, but we'll make up a name. But there's one other that there's probably more than one other, but I'm curious to see what you think about how you become a museum entomologist because people really do love museums. They do love insect collections. We have a great one at University of Nevada that we have these big tropical insects that people like to see. But it's really seems like there aren't many curator jobs at museums for entomologists. Do you have any insight on how you get that job?
Well, I think there used to be a lot more. I mean, I think there was more interest, more public interest in supporting museums and that kind of research. But I think most people that become curators they go the typical route. They go to school, they get a PhD, they get expertise in a particular group of insects, and then then they are able to obtain the relatively few jobs there are. But there are, I mean, all the major museums pretty much have entomologists, right?
Yeah, they do.
Smithsonian and American Museum, and
all the big museums, though, the
museum.
curators have PhDs, and they're really well-known taxonomists or systematists. They have made their name either as a grad student or postdoc, or they've been in the business for a while. But I have met people at museums who started maybe as an artist, who liked to draw insects, and they were at the museum, and then they became a curator somehow, or a volunteer who volunteered so much that then they needed them and had to have
Yeah.
them. And so there are other routes there, but it's one of the harder things. It's a lot easier to get a job for a chemical company, or figuring out how to kill insects, than it is as a museum curator of entomology.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So I think we've hit most of the kinds of careers, and such a diversity of pathways. One thing that I kind of like about all of these jobs is that AI is not going to replace us. I mean, we have to, the collecting insect, if you're in, mosquito control or something, there's no way we're nowhere near to being replaced in the types of jobs that you have to do when you're interested in controlling mosquitoes, or, curating insects, or collecting the insects, or, there's so much about insects that gives us job security as entomologists. Would you agree, or do you think we're going to have little robots doing all of this stuff that we do?
I mean, I've never really thought of the job security aspect of entomology, but no, I think I agree. Like, especially like the field stuff, AI can't go out and do surveys.
New mass array of AI-powered laser guns can target and fry thousands of bugs, and if it goes over beneficial bees, leaves them alone. That thing is the fly swatter of the future.
So maybe we do have job security, and maybe our job is interesting. There's multiple pathways to what we do. Last topic. Why are insects important?
I do an overview about why insects are important, how they're important as pollinators, of most of the world's flowering plants, how they're important as decomposers, of plant and animal matter and dung and carrion, how they're important as predators, controlling other insect populations. Yeah, and of course the more human side of things, how they're important currently and throughout history in vectoring diseases. Yeah, there's that whole thing about like sub-Saharan Africa. One of the things that really prevented that being turned into just cattle pasture was the tsetse fly, right?
Yep.
And the sleeping sickness that was vectored by tsetse flies. It kind of like was a buffer, and it affected the whole colonization and development of Africa. A lot of different cultures throughout the world have eaten, relied on insects for
Yeah.
food,
Mhm.
and that's something there's growing interest in that because of their efficiency, right,
Yeah.
and high nutritional value.
Do you also hit the like cultural, political, religious aspects? Because I've been working a lot with Warani and Quechua and other indigenous communities in South and Central America, and insects are a really important part of their religion, their storytelling, their art, and that's really true elsewhere, especially the art part. But do you do that?
I don't. I have to think. So I give at the beginning, I give a spiel about just some of the major ways in which insects are important. But then as I go through the different groups, I talk about, particular groups, how, like, of course, you got to talk about the scarabs and how they were, the Khepri
Oh,
or
yeah.
whatever, the god of
Yeah.
ancient Egypt, rolling the dung ball of the sun across the
Yeah,
skies.
that's the best. And even
Yeah.
like the legs of the scarab, the parts of the legs that make it look like rays of sun coming out of the ball of poop. Uh, I love the
Yeah.
scarab example. It's
So no,
good.
so certainly like as I go through the major groups and I talk about like like the Sterner Rankin hemipterans, right? Like the aphids and the whiteflies and their and mealybugs and scales, like they're super important herbivores that have big effects on crops and whatever. So I guess I'm going back into agricultural side of things, but I that's something I could probably actually like build more into is the cultural sort of significance of insects aside from as pests.
Yep. Okay, so we're gonna start looking to wind this up here. Is there any like final pearls of wisdom that you would like to spill over onto the podcast?
Um, you know, well, here's a pearl of wisdom, but this is maybe not for this class or whatever.
Yeah.
But I remember, when I was in graduate school, it was very ecologically focused, and it was like, "What's your question? What's your question?" You think of the question that you're interested in, and you go find the system that is most, uh, you know, uh, conducive to answering that question, or.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't do it that way. I decided, like, I really like ticking at flies, and
Yep.
I want to learn all about them and their interactions. I was also interested in ecology and all their interactions and tritrophic interactions. And I
Yep.
read an article by E.O. Wilson. It was basically advocating the way that I did it by saying, like, no, you don't necessarily have to just come with a question to find the system. You can find the system, be interested in something, and then explore all the many questions that that when you're looking at them that arise, right? And then sometimes there is an alternate route from aside from question besides question to system. You can study a system and then realize that what questions are most applicable and interesting about that system. And
Yeah, I agree.
it made me feel okay about what I was doing because I was kind of told this is not the way you do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I part of the reasons I stuck with caterpillars is because uh, before I went to graduate school, I read all of Stephen Jay Gould's books, and in one of his essays, he described this ichneumon parasitoid in great detail, and I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. I would love to study something like that someday. And throughout grad school, I really wanted to study parasitoids, but it was too hard. They're just good enough. They were just, they're kind of wimpy. You can't have a colony of them. And so I had
Right.
colonies of ants in the labs. And it wasn't until after I got my PhD that I finally got to kind of study parasitoids. But it was this long process, right? And the goal was always so that I could someday study parasitoids. It wasn't really question oriented,
But
but
I guess, in some ways, my route was the opposite of yours because I was really interested in parasitoids, but then I realized that I can't. It's really hard to study parasitoids except through their hosts.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
that's the way. And so then I got into caterpillars and started rearing caterpillars to get their
yeah.
parasitoids.
Okay, so I think we covered everything, and that was great. I'll see you next time, man. You just spent the last 20 minutes, half an hour listening to Hexapodcast, the podcast that alleviates your entomophobia, one insect or one entomologist at a time.
Lately your blue skies ain't coming, turning all the clouds gray. Baby, I can on the wheel right by your side. Hold on to the end of the line. Lay with you while the night is still, proves you haven't lost your will. Soon the road